Today we're going to talk about the headaches related to healthcare data. And I love the title, Learn Not to Hate Your Data. Because even all of us, even outside of healthcare and different businesses, we all have the love-hate, right, with data.
It's just so important to everything that we do. And when it comes to healthcare, it's even more so. And it's more complicated in many ways. And also, it's going to be used in so much more to manage patient care as well as maintaining costs and everything. So it becomes very, very complex. And there's so much competition with the different businesses that use it that all these things come together. And, Rhyno has done many data migrations and new systems and whatnot. And we hear about it all the time about the competition between the business and IT and which data sources and oh my God, you injected this data source and now everything's running 3 times slower and all these things. And we'll get into all that today.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
Let me first start from the top again. And so, this falls into the category of IT takes a village, and we truly believe this. There's no company that can do everything extremely well, but you make partnerships with the companies that can help you and support your. And that's our relationship with Excell HCA. And on the call, we have Costa Cases, who is the VP of Data and Analytics. And we've been talking for months now, since we had completed a Snowflake migration for one of our customers, about how we together. And I thought this was a great opportunity to bring Costa on this call and help explain all of the woes of data management. And we can talk it from an infrastructure perspective. We can talk it from a data analytics perspective. We can talk about it from a governance perspective. And we'll dive into all of that in the next hour. And hopefully leave everybody with hey, this is how we can start managing it. These are steps that we can take to help improve it because it's an ongoing, living, breathing thing. And hopefully we make people feel a little better and hate it a little bit less.
Well,
that's the goal.
Maybe if you guys can kind of help the dumb guy in the room here understand some of the specific challenges that are related to managing data within the healthcare environments, different healthcare systems, payer, payee, payer provider, right? And just kind of maybe give us a 30,000-foot view and kind of scoop down maybe for each.
I'll start at the 30,000. I'm going to hand it off to Costa when we get down to the 15,000 because she'll have a lot more details. But basically, there's multiple levels of challenge, and I think I touched on them real briefly. But let's go through them a little closer. There is the technical challenge. Where's your data stored? How is it managed? How is it ingested? Are you able to keep up with everything? Are you able to work with your businesses and your centralized IT teams and make sure that all your queries are solid, that you're not bringing down performance? Because the data is being used for different reasons. Some of it is just used for reporting, but some of it's used for real-time patient interaction. And there are portals that actually will go at that data, and if they're not performing enough, that slows things down. There are claim management systems that will be going after that data. There are call centers that will be going after that data. So from a technical perspective, you got to make sure that it's robust enough. So that's one of the areas that we'll dive into. Obviously, then there's clinical data versus payer data. And we know on the clinical side, data is becoming, first of all, you've got your regulations in healthcare that you don't have in all areas, which makes it more complex. Who gets access to see what? But then just importantly, how can you use that data to integrate with other third-party systems and actually improve patient care? We'll talk about integration between EMR data and, remote monitoring equipment, which is becoming very large in the healthcare industry. How do you make sure that they can share data appropriately so that you can actually improve the patient's care and actually reduce costs and improve outcomes? And then, of course, there's payer data that is used to manage your pharmacy, manage your provider experiences, to make appointments, and then also for the provider itself to be able to manage your care overall. So and then Costa, I'm sure you got a lot more detail than I just gave, but please join in.
So really, I think the key here is the amount of data that comes in. And every department, business unit has different needs, and the data that they need to go after is different. And then a lot of it overlaps. So you have multiple teams, multiple business units, multiple people going after the same data at the same time. So how do you democratize the data to allow the data and the access to the data and the reporting and the analytics to be performant, right? And there's, several different ways to go at it. And we'll probably get into some of that detail as, the conversation continues. But ultimately, where is the data? where's it going and how are you using it? I mean, those are really the big three questions that you have to ask when you go about these, sort of, modernization, transformation efforts, within the landscape. And I think that holds true. I think that holds true cross industry, but more so for the healthcare industry, because we're dealing with systems that in a lot of ways are now antiquated, outdated, and legacy. So how do you modernize that? How do you take all of those things that you've been doing for the last 20, 30 years and move it to the future?
And to your point, a lot of places, at least, I've run data groups in my past lives, and some of the data that you build is homegrown. So homegrown data warehousing, and then also you need to move to an enterprise system or more off-the-shelf product. And how do you do that and make sure that it's properly performant, it's properly built? There's data definitions that are out there, especially on the clinical side. One of the things when I used to work over at NYU was that the dean and CEO was very clear to his medical chairs. This is the data that we're using. You come to me with a report and it's wrong, then you better find out what's wrong with the data and go fix it. Because we're not going to use your data set, we're going to use my data set, and this is how we're going to define it. And that's key, because you need to define what a data element means, and then that data element needs to be used consistently across the enterprise. Otherwise, you're going to get conflicting outputs, and then what happens is you spend all your time circling, why is the data wrong?
Well, and that's why data governance is so important, right? I think we got to the data governance topic pretty quickly, but it's good. So, that's why a governance program is really important to an organization, because a data element definition in a database from a technical perspective can mean something totally different than what it means to the business, right? So you kind of have to marry the two things together, and you end up with a data dictionary that really has the technical definitions of everything that's in your databases, your data warehouses, lakes, whatever it may be. But you also have to develop a business glossary, right? And then you have to cross-reference the business glossary and that data dictionary on the technical side. So that way, both parties have an understanding of what that specific element means, both from a technical perspective and what it means to the business.
Right, and from a reporting perspective as well.
Right.
So some of these things get defined by different teams, especially if you have an organization that develops on top of their data. Those development teams have to use the same rules. Otherwise, again, you're going to get competing answers, and then you're spending your time troubleshooting. Why does it say this here and this over here? Especially when you're talking about things like call centers and you're talking about clinical data integration, it has to be consistent. So those data definitions, to your point, the governance has to be agreed to at a very high level and has to be maintained. Terrence, I think this is a common theme that we have in all of our LinkedIn lives, that without governance, whether we're talking application rationalization, whether we're talking about risk mitigation, and now whether we're talking about data, starts and ends with the governance and the structure behind it.
Yep. Can I ask you guys a question? This is probably a dumb question, but I've heard this term like infrastructure debt, right? When it was related to data. Can you guys help me get like an understanding of what that means and what's behind it and what's involved in it? I mean, I hate to say it, like I hear that, I'm like, I know what debt means. I'm a financial guy, right? I run my business, but like when it comes to infrastructure debt, I'm like, okay, I'm like, for some reason, my head is kind of doing a little bit of gymnastics on that. Costa, is that something you could help me understand?
Yeah. So we look at it two ways. So there's infrastructure debt, and then there's technical debt. And so infrastructure really just focuses on I'll use the word physical, like the physical infrastructure that you have. Now everybody's kind of moved to the cloud and things like that, but you still have these old legacy systems that are not performant, very difficult to upgrade. In a lot of cases, especially in the payer world, they're still using mainframes and things like that for the core administration systems. Those are big, giant boxes that have been around for 30 years. Parts are hard to find. Downtime is, extremely long to do any kind of upgrades and things like that. So that's sort of like your infrastructure debt. When it comes to technical debt, those are sort of the shortcuts that you've taken over the years to fix problems. You're not
Band-Aids.
Yes, exactly. You're not really fixing them. You're just band-aiding them. And then those band-aids,
layers and layers and layers,
time.
unfortunately.
Right. Yes, they build up over time, and at some point you have to address it. And so that's when, the question, you really have to answer the question when you go about these transformation and modernization journeys. And that question is, do you greenfield? Do you completely start from scratch? Do you take some things from your old systems and marry it with, capabilities within the new technology? Or are you going to wholesale lift and shift? Whatever you're doing today, you're going to do it tomorrow, just somewhere else. And so these are the questions that you kind of have to ask as you go about this.
So I mean, from your experience, because I find from our experience, very rarely will you totally greenfield when it comes to data, because you can't stop the moving train while you're
Right.
trying to fix the new one. So typically what I see is a lot of companies say, oh yeah, we'll lift and shift, we'll migrate it. So you get your first challenge of the length of time to actually migrate the data from one system to another. And so the first challenge is, can you make a migration in an amount of time that makes sense so you're not bringing the business down so you can do your testing and everything. But more importantly, once you start getting into it, then you have performance challenges to your infrastructure. Going to the cloud sounds like it's a great idea, but in some cases, you're actually slowing down your transaction times. So you used to have a millisecond response time, and you don't get that any longer. And how does that impede your business? So what's your experience? Are more people, or any people, let me ask you that way, are any people willing to greenfield in a project like this, or is it really just lift, shift, replace it, and repair?
So I've seen both, but when people look at the, I'll say, price tag of doing a greenfield, and there's some sticker shock there for sure, right? Because you have to run all of these things in parallel, because you have to have your development environment that you're building all of the new stuff in. Then you have to have, some parallel runs as you move to, your go live date and your transition date. So there's sticker shock there, both from a development effort perspective as well as infrastructure cost and things like that. Now, with the lift and shift, it seems on its face that it's less expensive, but it ends up being probably about the same from a cost perspective, because nothing is going to be, you can't completely lift and shift. The technology that we're moving to today function very differently than the technologies people have used in the past. And so those capabilities are different. So you spend a lot of time looking at how you can replicate those old capabilities in a new system that wasn't necessarily designed to function that way.
Exactly. No, that's exactly
and so you
right.
bring over all of that technical debt, and you add additional technical debt on top of it.
Well, that was the case in our latest lift and shift data migration. We were pulled in at the end to try to help bring it over the finish line, and we just kept hearing, our architecture is not right. There's problems with the data sourcing. There's problems with the ingestion. There's problems with the queries, but we can't even think about fixing those until we go live. So you're focusing on bringing it live, causing as least amount of damage as you can, bringing the system functional, and then you're back to square one, almost looking at the overarching architecture. And it's not just one layer of architecture, unfortunately. All the data sets might have a different set of ingestion rules, might have a different set of processing rules. And so it's really a huge endeavor. So it's a project to me that never finishes. It goes back to that application rationalization kind of model as well. If you're doing it right, it never ends. You should constantly be optimizing it as you go.
Right.
So let's take a moment, step back a little bit. We're saying a lot of things pretty quickly. So and it's good. It's a great dialogue. But let's go back to why data is critical. We talked about that again. So you're looking at the clinical data, and we do a lot of integration with EMRs and some third-party applications that help patients get pre and post care education. We're starting to work on tools that will help to monitor some of your remote monitoring tools, whether it's a spinometer or a pulsometer or these types of things, and actually then proactively are able to report back to you if they see data that is concerning. Let's say it that way. Oh my God, your pulse rate's a little low. Maybe you need to go to the ER. Maybe you need to sit down. Maybe we can interact and stop you from going from the emergency room. Those types of things. So that data is becoming more and more critical across systems. So you've got data that's ingested into an EMR, and EMR is ingesting data from a bunch of different ancillary systems. That information now needs to go to a third-party system, and that's why that consistency is there, and also the timing of all that data. So we talk about clinical data; it's got its own level of complexity. Then you get it to the payer side, and then you start talking about a bunch of different stuff. You got regulatory data, you got financial data, you got call center metrics, you got provider engagement data, you've got member engagement data, and all these things compete against each other, and the businesses compete against their resources. So now you start working on a centralized model for data ingestion or a decentralized model. So all these things become complicated, which then again go to the importance of the data governance. So just wanted to restate that, how important all that is, because every one of those can impact things as they go down, both from a business solution down to a technical solution.
100%. The real-time data, right, from these various medical devices and things like that really gets into a topic of around the Internet of Things and how quickly you have to be able to stream that data into whatever system needs to get it, like an EMR. And that has its own challenges, because then, okay, so what are your notifications going to look like? How are you notifying a physician or a nurse or a caregiver that something's going wrong? And then how quickly can they respond to whatever that incident is? And that is just volumes and volumes of data. And then what do you do with that after, right? Because you don't necessarily want to get rid of it. You can do a lot of things from an analytical perspective, like trend analysis, right? You can look at, okay, just from a patient outcome perspective, you have this, population of patients that have all seen, that have all had like a similar event, right? A similar event occur through a device. So why is that? Is it maybe something that needs to be looked at from an R&D perspective with the device? Is there something, can the device be improved to, okay, well, maybe we have an entire population of patients where we have to look at their treatment plan differently. And so there's a bunch of different ways that data can be used.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, we've discussed infrastructure debt already, which is, from our perspective, huge, because if you can't get the performance and you can't get the turnaround time that you need, nothing else matters. But why don't you take a moment and kind of let's go into detail about like data literacy. We talked about that at a high level. There's a couple other areas I think we need to kind of address at a more detailed level. Speak of the gaps in data literacy.
Yeah, so, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying before around that business glossary versus a data dictionary, right? So everybody within an organization needs to understand the data at multiple levels. They need to understand it from a technical level and how it works within, the databases, data warehouses, et cetera, where that data lives. They also have to understand how it's being used from a business perspective and what that means. And so that understanding is really about data literacy. And so your organization become more literate about the data that they're using every single day, more literate about what the metrics and KPIs are within a dashboard, more literate around, the day-to-day workflows of, let's say, a case manager, right? A nurse that's handling case management for a payer. All of those things come together. And then you start looking at, okay, well, how can we improve all of these things? How can we improve patient outcomes, member outcomes? How can we improve provider, engagement, member engagement? How can we improve call center metrics, right? And that really comes from a place of understanding and being data literate. Now, people are also, and I want to touch on quickly just the AI topic as it relates to this.
Thank you.
Because it's a big conversation and it's not something that we're really going to be able to go deep into here today. It's a very broad topic and it's far reaching. But people are looking for AI to help solve problems, to become more efficient, to get better insights, to reduce, the time it takes to perform a task, things like that. Well, all of that relies on the underlying data. And that data has to be understood, it has to be governed, and it has to be of quality. If you're, it's the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And that doesn't change with AI, right? You really have to understand your data. It has to be of quality. You have to manage it very well in order for, AI to use it in, in a way that, benefits the business.
and
And this is what
does no harm.
It does no harm.
There's two sides to that.
And it's not going to go, and it's not going to go and clean it all up, right? It's not like you can put an AI bot in your, your data lake and say, go help us clean all this stuff up that we were pushing in the closet for the last few years.
That is 100% a use case, and there are people actually working on it. I've kind of been following that trend a little bit.
Wow.
Once these things start to come to market, it will be very interesting on how the data landscape changes. I think we're probably a year or two away from seeing that in a major market trend. But it's starting. People are starting to do that.
And I was at the New Jersey HIMSS last year, and it was actually a conversation that was starting. I think it is starting. You're right, but I think it's starting slower in healthcare because people are just nervous. So I think we got to see the safety and the efficacy of it outside of healthcare a little bit before we start thinking about touching true patient data with AI and be concerned about the outcome. Now, AI can be used for certain things for sure, and we can talk about that forever about where AI comes into handy in the clinical world. But massaging data will take a little bit of time, in my opinion.
Yeah. And, this is the example that I like to use. Everybody's probably played around with ChatGPT, right, at this point. Everybody knows what it is. People, especially in the business world, are looking at it for ways to make their life easier in, many ways. I, as, somewhat of an expert, right, subject matter expert in data, the data lifecycle, I can go ask it questions about that domain. I can ask it a question and ask that same question 4 different ways and get 4 different answers, but I know enough to understand if the response that I've gotten is accurate and correct.
Exactly.
Now, if I go ask it a question of, let's say, something like nuclear fusion, I know nothing about nuclear fusion, right? Do I know what it's telling me is accurate? I don't have Neil deGrasse Tyson's phone number, so I can't call him and ask him, hey, ChatGPT said this, is that real, right? I don't have the ability to do that. So can I actually trust it? And that really ultimately goes back to the data quality. So your data quality is good, the more trust you can put into what you're getting from an outcome perspective with AI.
Exactly.
Not only with AI, but just, your descriptive analytics, your dashboarding, your reporting in general.
You'll see less exceptions so that the data becomes more regulated and resolvable. So let me ask a different question. Because we're talking about data literacy, we're talking about data governance, and they intermingle. In your experience, because obviously you can't touch all the businesses all the time, so even data literacy conversations have to start somewhere and grow. What's the right entry point? What's the right cadence of getting something going? Because I think our customers would be interested in understanding how do we get started? Because it's not a one and done. It's not a 30-day engagement and all of a sudden everything's fixed. That's not the case. So what's your experience in that?
So from a data literacy perspective, data governance, really, this is less about the technical and more about a culture change and a shift within an organization. So it takes all parts of the organization, top down, and it has to be top down led. And one of the ways that we do that, is we come in and really facilitate through some workshops, right? To understand what the business problems are, to understand what the technology problems are, and kind of marry those things together. And what we find a lot of times is that these conversations start from a technical perspective, but they really get into business strategy. And your business strategy is really what is going to drive any other effort. And we can put together a roadmap and a plan for people to go down this data governance journey, this data literacy journey. And it's going to take changes in roles. It's going to take shifts in technology. It's going to take shifts from, an organizational vision perspective in some cases in order to enable all of these things and be successful. Because you're right, Chris, it's not one and done, right? Once you commit to this, once you commit to this, you have to commit to it long term.
Well, and I think one of the hardest things to do is to get the business to understand that they need to align. So, every business has their own goals and their own deliverables and their own P&L and all that type of stuff. But as you said, data is not siloed 100%. It goes across. And when that does, you have to understand that maybe this is just as this business function is just as important as your business function, even though it's outside of your purview. And how do you make sure that both are successful?
Exactly.
I have a question on that because that's kind of a running theme, right, Chris, that I've heard across multiple conversations specific to this. That
Mhm.
it's a, that it's a cultural issue, that it's a top down, right? It needs to be driven from the top down. Is that one of the pitfalls, Costa, that you see, or not pitfalls? Is that one of the challenges that you see organizations are having, just in terms of not only having the culture, but just having that driven from the top down to say, yes, this is vitally important. I need to have uh, you know, cross operational cohesion on how we go about doing this. Maybe talk just a little bit through that.
That is, it's very true. So in my experience, anytime an organization looks at some kind of change as technical only, it's almost doomed to fail,
Exactly.
because the focus then becomes on the technology itself rather than the impact of change. And when you don't focus on the impact of change, when that new technology, you flip that switch and it goes on, if if anything disrupts the business at all, it's going to have a cascading effect. It's going to snowball and just get worse and worse and worse.
And I would imagine too that when you tie it to technical, that the non-technical people go, "Oh, that's my key to just check out. That's not going to pertain to me." I know that
And
Right.
I know the
Exactly.
IT guys will figure that out, and they'll just come and train me and tell me
listen,
how to do things. Right?
everybody
Right.
has day jobs. Exactly. They don't have time to be thinking about this all the time. But the truth of the matter is, they need to. And for example, in the last migration that we just completed, I mean, the majority of the data came from an integrated IT system that fed the data every night and through the batch processes, and that was hard enough to get right, and
Mhm.
even to find out how you test it, because for those batch process is an ongoing thing on the payer side where things happen in a progression order. Data is loaded here, and then it's loaded there, and then it's moved over here, and data comes from 10 different systems. Well, now you've got two different systems that are running a batch simultaneously, in
Mhm.
theory, but is it truly simultaneously? Some of that data is real-time data, and how do you actually do the data comparison of the two to actually ever say, hey, thumbs up, we're ready to go?
Yeah.
But let's even put that to the side for a second. That's complicated enough. Then you've got all your businesses with all your people that are very well serving, well deserving, well intended people trying to get reports out for their businesses, but they don't necessarily follow the standards of the query logic, or they don't follow the standards of data access, or they're trying to manipulate, and all of a sudden they're pulling things down. So now, and then you've got 44 teams out there that have to test their data as well. So all this is extremely complicated to make sure that we continue to be able to move things forward, be able to do the migrations, but also keep everybody running without hurting each other. Again, do no harm type of scenario.
Right. And there's a really good recent example of where that went wrong. There is what I'll call a super regional payer in the US that had their stars ratings cut drastically because of a problem with their data. The data that they reported to CMS was inaccurate, and it caused their stars ratings to be decreased, which means less reimbursement from
Huge
CMS and
financial
the
impact.
federal government.
Huge.
Yep. And not only
And
that, when you see consumers can see the stars ratings and see that, a competitor in that specific region or state has better stars ratings than this one that took a hit. So now you start losing members
Yeah.
to your competition because, on the face of it, it looks like, well, they're doing a bad job, but that may not necessarily be the case.
Well, and that's just it. And there's a lot of regulatory requirements out there. You mentioned CMS, which is forever. And some of the data that's processed for CMS is very impactful, very huge, very, very process driven, those types of things, processor driven. I mean, so it takes a lot of work to see if they're going, and one mistake can make a huge difference. And then it takes forever to recover from that.
It does.
So let me ask a slightly different question. So we're talking
Sure.
about all this wonderful data coming in. When is there too much data for decision? When is there a data overload? How do you define that?
A data overload really comes back to not understanding your data, right? So when you have too much data, that means you haven't really defined your metrics and defined your KPIs. And you have to understand what you're measuring yourself against in order for the data to be valuable. Because you don't need all of it. Not in every case, right? You need subsets of data for individual use cases throughout the business. You don't need all of it, right? And is this one thing important to, this business unit? Maybe not. So why are we including it in our report? It's just noise. So if you can't really define your metrics, can't really define your KPIs and how you're going to measure your business, then that's when you get into data overload.
So and that's a really important point. So we talk about governance, we talk about data literacy, we talk about performance, we talk about infrastructure debt. Then add on top of it, how do you remediate or retire data that's no longer necessary? Is that do you even find that customers are engaged in that part of it at this point, or is it just continually building on top of each other to a point where, first of all, it hurts your performance, and second of all, you never get a chance to clean up the old data?
Well, you don't. And organizations don't clean up their old data. They just keep compounding it. Now, they may not be collecting that old data, right? And because it's coming from a retired system or something that's been deprecated, whatever it may be, but it's still there. It's chewing up resources from a storage perspective. You may be even still consuming it because it's showing up on a report that hasn't been updated in 3 years. So that's when you start kind of get into the FinOps perspective of it. So what do I do with this old data? Yeah. Do I actually need it anymore? And that really becomes a business conversation, because somebody's going to say, oh, I've always had this on my report.
Exactly.
I need it, right? And so now you have to have the conversation. Do you really need it? Is it really important?
And it's an uncomfortable conversation in many cases.
It is.
Tell me why you need it. Exactly why are you using this data? Is it really needed? I agree. So, okay. So we've been talking about all the challenges. We're about halfway through here, a little bit over halfway through. Let's talk about some solutions. So,
Sure.
let's why don't you dive us into data literacy and the data lifecycle? I mean, there's so much to that. And again, this goes back to the ongoing living, breathing. This isn't a one and done thing. This is something that needs to be embedded into the organization. So what are the areas of data lifecycle?
Okay. So when we talk about the data lifecycle, so we talk about, sourcing the data, right? What are the data sources? Where is the data coming from? That could be a core admin system from a payer perspective, could be an EMR, right? Could be any number of things. And that's where the data lives day to day. That's where it's, being used operationally. And then you get into the ingestion, you get into data ingestion, and that is, okay, well, how am I going to get that data? Once I've identified the data that I need, how am I going to get it, right? And then you get into sort of the data warehousing, data storage perspective. Okay, now I'm getting the data. Where am I going to put it? Yeah. Am I going to put it in a data warehouse? Am I going to put it in a data lake? Am I going to put it in a lake house? You start throwing around all these terms and people start asking, okay, well, what's the difference between all of these things, right? Well, they all have their own purpose. Some of them can do many different things, and that's kind of probably a deeper dive into the topic that we're going to get to here.
All right, but I got to ask, what's a lake house? I haven't heard that one before.
So
all those, Chris, you're like, hey, that lake house, that sounds.
Lake house is new to me. So go ahead, tell me what that's about.
So lake house is kind of it's a hybrid between a data warehouse and a data lake, right? So you kind of get some marriage of functionality between a data warehouse and a data lake with a lake house. Wasn't going to start like name dropping technologies here because that's not what we're here to discuss. But a prime example of that would be like Databricks, right? That's a prime example of one. And then once you've landed the data somewhere, now you have to transform it to actually make it usable. Now that's a data transformation piece of it. And that is, you're getting information like demographics is an easy one for everybody to understand. Have your first name, your last name, your date of birth, your social security number, your address, your phone number, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody knows who they are and what those mean to them. Well, you're getting that information from, 1,000 different systems. Yeah. If one of them is wrong in any one of those other 1,000 systems, how do you correct it? And that's your data quality, and which leads to your data transformation. And that data transformation is about consolidating that data down, harmonizing that data down, so you have that single view of a person, let's say.
or provider for that matter.
Or a provider, right? So that's why I use the term person, right? Because we could be talking about a patient, we could be talking about a provider, a member, right? And all of that is really important when it comes to, how the data is going to help you manage outcomes just across the board. Then you get into sort of, then you get to the data visualization pieces of it. Okay, now, so I've transformed my data, I've distilled it down, I've consolidated it. Okay, so now how am I going to visualize that? What dashboards do I need? What metrics am I tracking? What KPIs am I tracking? Who needs to get the reports? Do they need to be available real time? Can, they be available on demand? And you start getting into those conversations, and then finally leading into advanced analytics and AI, right? Because that's the next step. How can you be predictive around the data that you're getting in? And I think this is, it's really an important topic to me, because if you do it right and you have the right focus as an organization, you can really improve member outcomes and patient outcomes.
100%. And that's the key, and that's what everyone's goal is. But there's so many ways to get there. But you're right, ultimately, there's so much power here that can be, and real life affecting power that just makes it so important. One thing we haven't touched upon was analytic tools. So we talked about the data ingestion, we talked about the governance, the life cycle, all that. But at what point? And I know it's cart before the horse, maybe a little bit. But at what point are your decisions on your analytic tools core to the way that your data is either being ingested or managed, or do you have to make sure that your data is agnostic to whatever tools are being used?
So most analytical tools are agnostic, right? You can pretty much connect any of the top, let's say top 3 analytical tools out there to any data warehouse, any database, any data lake, whatever it may be. The question really comes down to use case. And it comes down to capabilities within your organization, right? You may have people already that understand one tool better than another. So you're going to use that one tool because you don't have to train, you don't have to hire people with new skill sets. So that's really when it becomes sort of an organizational question, an organizational decision. In my experience, every analytical tool kind of does the same thing. Some do things better than others, and so that's sort of like the trade-off.
Well, I think you just hit upon it, because from the way I look at it is, what is the balance of standardizing your tool across the enterprise so you can get consistent output, and then you're also not competing with resources and things like that, versus that 10% or 15% that one tool might be better than another, And I guess that trade-off, to your point, has to come from the end users and the governance of the business to decide what. Because I see a lot of times tools are being developed or selected because of a personal preference and not necessarily because of a technical outcome.
Well, and there's also other, I should say, factors in that as well, and that is, could be, based on the cloud service provider that you're using. Like if you use one versus the other, one tool may work better, or it may be just part of your overall package with that cloud service provider. So you're just going to go ahead and use it because you're already kind of paying for it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Is that the right decision? Maybe, maybe not. Is it giving you what you need at the end of the day? If yes, then okay. If not, then you need to kind of look at maybe other options that are out there.
Okay, so we talked about data-driven culture, we talked about governance, we talked about all these wonderful things. Let's talk about the broader life cycle. So obviously all this starts with workshops to get to understand what your data needs are, what your data issues are. What's your recommendation on how often that needs to be revisited? Again, I'm always concerned, and I don't blame organizations. Everybody's busy. There's always new product. There's always new requirements coming out. There's new tools, whatever. But how often do you need to revisit your data strategy and maybe restart those workshops in order to make sure that you're doing it right?
So anytime you have programs like that, you probably want to, at a bare minimum, revisit it yearly. right? Just like you do, when we start talking about like security and compliance, right? You have to revisit those things like yearly or even sometimes, every 6 months, because those things change, right? And your business changes right along with those things. So as often as your business is changing, you need to revisit everything else, right? Your business strategy is going to affect everything else, not just your data governance policies, not just your data landscape. It's going to affect everything. So when you look at changing and discussing your business strategy, you have to then revisit everything else that you've done, data included.
And thank you. That's exactly what I wanted you to say and what I wanted people to hear. It's really that important. And Terrence, we talk about this in many of these LinkedIn Live events we do. And what that tells me, especially when we were talking about security and all the overhead that's going to come from cybersecurity and things like that in the future, it's a lot of energy. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of people management. It's a lot of ongoing effort. And it's hard to maintain that from an organizational structure. But I hope that people realize that that's really the criticality, because otherwise you're going to either incur technical debt or performance issues or data inconsistencies or something that's really star rating reductions.
Yeah.
And then once you get down to the star rating reduction, you go, geez, we probably should have done something differently. So I'm hoping that our audience can realize that, we're not trying to create work to create work.
No.
We're creating work for value.
Yes.
Costa, let me ask this just on that, Chris, like I always look at things from a standpoint of like, hey, tell me someone who's doing it really well, right? Like tell me someone that we can kind of model after, right? Sometimes it's better to model than it is to try and create something from scratch, so to speak.
That's
right.
for sure.
So like, tell me about some of the organizations, some of the things that they're, and maybe even look back, right? Here's where they started and here's where they are now too. Right. So, but I like looking at those because I think that always helps me put things in perspective in terms of someone or an organization to model that we can kind of leverage what they've already done successfully and try and, maybe replicate some of what they've done in our organization.
So I don't know that I have a specific organization example, but I have an industry example. So from a technology perspective, the industry that everyone really is always chasing is finance. Finance is really out ahead of everything else because of all of the regulations that have been placed upon them over, let's say, the last 20 years with some of the economic issues that have gone on, within the US, right? So they've had to adapt and change very, very quickly. And then on top of it, we've gotten into truly real-time transactions, right? You pick up your phone, you can tap it on anything, and instantly you've paid for it, right? So that is really the industry that most everybody is chasing from just from a technology and data maturity perspective. So things have kind of sort of been modeled after that. We take a look at what the financial industry is doing, and then how do we take the things that they're doing really well and then apply them to the healthcare industry.
Well, and the challenge there is healthcare is a very expensive industry to start, and in order to model those financial systems, there's investment, and it's really hard to balance between core clinical systems, data models, patient care, payer care, member care, all those types of things. So it just becomes very complicated to say we're going to invest all these dollars to do it right when there's all dollars that are already being reviewed on a regular basis already. Healthcare has its own challenges, as we always said, and it's I love the industry. I've been in there for 30 plus years, but it's got its own challenges, and they're not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. All right, so it's 44 after. We got about 15 minutes here, and I know that we tend to go long-winded on our closings. So Costa, how do we give people advice on how to get started? What's the easiest, best step? I mean, obviously, this isn't a sales show. We're not trying to sell anything, but how should people be going after improving this, so they hate their data less?
So you have to make an investment in it. You have to decide. First comes a decision from an organization. I want to invest. I want to get better. I want to change. Once you've made that decision, now you have to bring people together. Find your representatives from the business side, from the technology side, and the people that sit in the middle. Who are your leaders in those various spaces, and how do we bring them together? And that's really where the workshops come in, right? You bring all of those people together, and then you have people like you and I, Chris, that help facilitate and ask the hard questions.
Exactly. And then ultimately collate the data and then hopefully present roadmaps that go with it. So,
Right.
and the reason I bring that up is because, it's the first 5 steps are the hardest or whatever in any journey,
Mm-hmm.
getting the right people in the room to discuss it. But once you do that, I've yet to leave any of those assessments, anybody feeling that, wow, that was a waste of time. We didn't learn anything new and everything's perfect and we can just move forward. How much, from your experience, what is an organizational's input effort to do something like that? Is this a couple of weeks to organize and do? The workshops themselves are how long? Those types of things.
Right. So we have some really good structure around our workshops, and we basically tailor make the workshops to the organization. There's a little bit of pre-work that goes in because we want to talk to the stakeholders. We want to understand what their goals are going into it, and let them have input in the topics that they want to discuss in the workshops. And typically, we do, workshops a day, right? We like to get everybody in the room.
Yep.
In person is always better
Always
than being, doing it virtually through Teams or Zoom or whatever it may be. And really talk about it and really have some activities. This isn't, it's not a complaining session. This is about, getting up and moving around the table, putting stickies on the wall, discussing the various options, the difficulties, the challenges, and really kind of flipping that around and saying, okay, these are our challenges, but what are our goals? What can we do to achieve those goals? We have a great exercise that I like to do called How Might We? And that is, you ask yourself, how might we do something, right? And what is that something? Okay, how might we do it, right? This is what we need to accomplish that. And then who's it going to benefit? And then once you can link those things together, then you can begin to prioritize. And then you have a vision of what that future may look like. And so from, just an overall engagement perspective, really 8 to 12 weeks, right? Once we get out of the workshop, we have a lot of information to go on. We have a lot of people that we want to talk to, a lot of people that we want to continue conversations with, certain pieces of information and nuggets that we've gotten that we'll want to dig into deeper. And at the end of the day, we want to provide you a plan and a roadmap on how you can execute on this.
Yeah. No, I thank you, and I appreciate the detail because we see the same thing. On-site is always better, and I know we live in a hybrid remote world these days, and you can get a lot of good work done. We were always shocked when COVID hit how much we were able to actually get done and how many cutovers were actually still successful.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about the human interaction, looking at people in a room and getting that done. And I would agree, a day, maybe 2 days is probably the appropriate time. You need to give people time to think and come back the next day sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So, hitting the end of our time here, Terrence, are there any other questions you'd like us to cover? And Costa, is there anything else that we've missed?
I think, let me ask Costa this, because just on the workshops, who in the organization, this probably goes back to what we were talking about in the very beginning, but who in the organization should be included in those workshops? And how would, maybe someone go about carrying the flag within their own organization to maybe kind of get that going?
So it has to start with leadership. If leadership is not in the room, then it's not going to be effective. The last couple of workshops that we've done, the CEO has been involved and active participant in the workshops. And when that person is there, when that CEO is there, it tends to be more successful. And shockingly, you wouldn't think it's counterintuitive, but people are more engaged when that level of leadership is there. It seems counterintuitive, but it's very true.
And I agree with everything you just said. The challenge we sometimes have is when you get the engagement from that level of leadership, how does it then get down to the next level of the people who are actually going to have to implement? So are these people in the room as well, or is it two levels of?
No, these people, it should be representative. It should be a representative group, not just a C-suite, right? You need directors there, you need managers there, and in some cases, you need individual contributors there, because you're going to be discussing topics that, you know, the C-suite or leadership may not actually have insight to.
In many cases, won't and don't need to in reality,
because they're not, you know, hands-on keyboard doing the day-to-day work. They're leading the organization. But you're going to get the most insight out of the person that is at their keyboard doing a function daily.
So I think ultimately, Terrence, what you're looking for is a cross-representation. And I agree, having key leadership is there because people get engaged. It's a good dialogue. It shows effort and all those good things. But at the same time, you need the level of expertise in order to really come out with anything that is worth following.
And what you're going to get too at the end of it is you're going to understand where you are on the data maturity curve, right? To bring it back and focus a little bit more on data, because we've gotten a little broad here at the end. But you know, you really start focusing. You really get an idea of where you are on that data maturity curve. Are you lagging? Are you keeping up? Are you out ahead? Right. And we can help you understand where you are and the areas that you need to focus on to become a leader.
So that's an interesting point, because we talk about that in some of our other conversations where you can get a baseline of data. Where does your organization fit on the curve? So to your point, there is the data maturity metrics that can be used to give somebody a sense.
Yes, absolutely.
That's extremely important. Well, I think we've gotten to the end here a little bit. I just wanted to open it up one last time. Terrence, is there anything else you think we need to answer?
No, and you know, I mean, I think we did a really good job. I think we did a really good job of keeping it on time this time and getting it all in. So maybe
we're getting tighter every time.
Yeah,
Terrence.
we are. Maybe we give people back their 8 minutes, unless they want to hear about our remodeling plans between the three of us, which I don't know if they.
There you go.
Do.
There you go. So listen, I just want to thank everybody for spending some time with us. We really do appreciate our audience listening in. We like the feedback that we get from this. Costa, thank you very much for joining today. It was a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate all the insights that you brought here. You know, you and I will be continuing talking and seeing how we can partner together on a bunch of things. We really hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and look forward to another topic probably in the next couple of weeks. Whether we dive deeper into data storytelling or something like that, or we move on to another topic and just go there.
And more importantly, they'll get updates on our remodeling, both my flooring and your basement. That's really what they're looking for. I mean, let's be honest, guys.
We should probably have a picture section where people can go in and see my basement modeling, your basement modeling. It'd be great. Thank you all again. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Terrence. It's been a pleasure.
All right.
All right.
Have a great one. Thank you.
Thanks.